The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room flickered overhead as 23-year-old Kali Finley pressed the ice pack against her swollen left eye, her hands trembling despite her efforts to appear composed. The metallic taste of blood still lingered in her mouth from where her lip had split, and every breath sent sharp pains through her ribs. But it wasn't the physical pain that made her stomach churn. It was the conversation she'd overheard in the ambulance, the one that shattered everything she thought she knew about her family. "Just tell them you fell down the stairs," her father Marcus had whispered urgently to her uncle David as the paramedics worked. "The family can't handle another scandal, not after what happened to your brother." What Kali didn't know was that paramedic Janet Rodriguez had heard every word, and that this moment would become the catalyst for a journey that would expose decades of buried secrets, transform her understanding of courage, and ultimately lead her to become one of the most influential advocates for domestic violence survivors in the Pacific Northwest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kali Finley had always believed her family was different from the broken ones she saw on the evening news. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Bellevue, Washington, the Finley family appeared to have it all together. Her father, Marcus, was a respected real estate developer who'd built half the luxury condominiums dotting the Seattle skyline. Her mother, Rebecca, taught piano lessons from their sprawling Tudor-style home and volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend. Family barbecues were legendary in their neighborhood, complete with Marcus's famous smoked salmon and Rebecca's homemade blackberry pie. But appearances, Kali was learning, could be devastatingly deceiving. The morning had started like any other Saturday in October. Kali had driven over to her Uncle David's apartment in Capitol Hill to help him move some furniture, a favor she'd regretted the moment she'd agreed to it. David Finley, Marcus's younger brother, was what the family diplomatically called troubled. At 38, he'd never held a steady job for more than 6 months, had been through 2 messy divorces, and had a drinking problem that everyone acknowledged but no one directly addressed. Kali had always felt sorry for David. He'd been the artistic one in the family, the dreamer who'd wanted to be a photographer before life had somehow beaten that ambition out of him. When they were kids, he'd been her favorite uncle, the one who'd sneak her extra cookies at family gatherings and listen to her rambling stories about school with genuine interest. But somewhere along the way, that gentleman had been replaced by someone bitter and unpredictable. The apartment reflected David's current state of mind. Empty beer bottles cluttered the coffee table, dirty dishes filled the sink, and the air was thick with the stale smell of cigarettes and disappointment. Kali had tried to make conversation as they moved his old dresser, asking about his latest photography project. But David had been increasingly agitated, muttering about family obligations and how everyone expected him to be grateful for their help. "You don't understand what it's like," he'd said, his voice slurring slightly, despite it being only 11 in the morning. "Everyone thinks Marcus is so perfect, so successful, but you don't know what he did to me when we were kids, what our father did to both of us." Kali had felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Her grandfather had died when she was 10, and she remembered him as a stern but loving man who taught her to play chess and told elaborate bedtime stories. The idea that there had been darkness in her family's past felt impossible to reconcile with her memories. "Uncle David, maybe we should focus on getting this moved," she had suggested, gently, trying to redirect his attention to the dresser they were supposed to be carrying downstairs. That's when everything had gone wrong. David had stopped moving suddenly, his grip tightening on his end of the dresser until his knuckles went white. "You think I'm just some pathetic drunk, don't you?" he'd said, his voice ticking on an edge that made Kali's skin crawl. "Just like everyone else in this family, just like your precious father." "That's not what I think at all," Kali had replied, trying to keep her voice calm and steady. "I know you're going through a tough time, but—" "A tough time?" David had laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You have no idea what a tough time looks like, little princess. You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter. College paid for, nice car, trust fund waiting for you when you turn 25. You've never had to fight for anything."
The accusation stung because there was some truth to it. Kali had been privileged, and she knew it. But she had also worked hard, graduating summa cum laude from the University of Washington with a degree in social work, volunteering at homeless shelters throughout college, and now working 60-hour weeks at a nonprofit organization that helped at-risk youth. Her trust fund remained untouched because she believed in earning her own way. "You're right that I've been fortunate," she had said carefully, "but that doesn't mean I don't understand struggle or that I don't care about—" David had dropped his end of the dresser then, letting it crash into the wall and leaving a dent in the drywall. "Don't you dare lecture me about caring," he snarled, taking a step toward her. "You and your whole generation think you understand everything, think you can fix everyone with your social work degree and your bleeding heart." Kali had felt the first flutter of real fear then, but she had tried to de-escalate the situation. "I'm not trying to lecture you or fix anything. I just want to help you move your furniture like we planned." But David was beyond reasoning. Years of resentment, alcohol, and whatever demons he had been carrying had finally boiled over. "Help?" he repeated mockingly. "The only help I need is for my family to finally acknowledge what they did to me, what your grandfather did, what your father knew about and never stopped." Before Kali could respond, David had grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Maybe it's time someone in this family learned what it felt like to be helpless," he'd said. And that's when Kali realized she was in serious danger.
What followed was a blur of terror and desperate self-defense. David had shoved her against the wall, and when she'd tried to get away, he'd backhanded her across the face. The force of the blow had split her lip and sent her stumbling, but adrenaline had kept her moving. She'd managed to knee him in the stomach and break free, but as she'd run toward the door, he'd grabbed her again, this time throwing her down onto the hardwood floor. The fall had knocked the wind out of her, and pain had exploded through her ribs. David had stood over her, breathing heavily, his face a mask of rage and something else, something that made her realize this wasn't just about family resentment anymore. "Please," she'd gasped, trying to crawl toward her purse where her phone was. "Uncle David, please stop." For a moment, he'd seemed to come back to himself, looking down at her with something like horror. But then his expression had hardened again. "You're just like all of them, too good for the truth, too perfect to understand what real pain feels like." He'd reached down as if to grab her again, and that's when Kali had found her voice and screamed, a sound that pierced through the apartment walls and brought Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor, pounding on the door. The interruption had given Kali the chance she needed to get to her phone and call 911, but not before David had landed one more blow, this time to her face, leaving her with the black eye that was now throbbing under the ice pack. The paramedics had arrived within minutes, professional and efficient as they'd assessed her injuries. Nothing was broken, they'd determined, but they'd recommended a trip to the emergency room for x-rays and observation. David had seemed to sober up instantly when he'd seen the uniforms, switching into a performance of concerned family member that was so convincing, Kali had almost doubted her own memory of what had happened. "I don't know what got into her," he'd told the paramedics, shaking his head sadly. "She was helping me move furniture and she just lost her balance, fell right down the stairs, hit her face on the banister on the way down. I tried to catch her, but..." He'd shrugged helplessly, the picture of a distraught uncle. Kali had been too shocked and in too much pain to correct his story immediately, and when her father Marcus had arrived at the hospital, called by David, his first words hadn't been to ask if she was okay. Instead, he'd pulled David aside, just out of what he thought was earshot, and that's when she'd heard the conversation that changed everything. "Just tell them you fell down the stairs. The family can't handle another scandal, not after what happened to your brother." Your brother? But David was Marcus's only brother, which meant Kali's mind raced, trying to make sense of the implication. Another scandal? What had happened before that she didn't know about? And that's when she'd noticed paramedic Janet Rodriguez standing nearby, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent, clearly having heard everything Marcus had said. Their eyes had met for just a moment, and Kali had seen something there. Recognition, understanding, and a kind of sad knowing that suggested this wasn't just about family resentment anymore.
Now, sitting in the emergency room with her father pacing nearby and David giving his statement to a police officer, Kali felt like she was seeing her family clearly for the first time. The perfect facade was cracking, and underneath was something rotten that had been festering for years. Her mother, Rebecca, had arrived shortly after Marcus, immediately fussing over Kali's injuries, but also shooting worried glances at her husband. "Are you sure it was just a fall, sweetheart?" she'd asked quietly when they had a moment alone. The question had hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. It suggested that Rebecca suspected the truth, or at least suspected there was more to the story than David's version. But when Kali had opened her mouth to tell her mother what really happened, she'd caught sight of Marcus watching them intently from across the room. "Keep this quiet," he'd mouthed when he thought no one was looking. But someone had been looking. Paramedic Janet Rodriguez was still there, finishing up her paperwork, and Kali was beginning to realize that this woman might be the key to understanding what was really happening in her family and what had happened before.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 days after the incident at David's apartment, Kali was still struggling to make sense of what had happened when her doorbell rang at 7:30 in the evening. She opened the door to find Janet Rodriguez standing on her doorstep, still in her paramedic uniform, holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression that was equal parts determined and apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you at home," Janet said, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of her Puerto Rican heritage. "But I think we need to talk. I'm Janet Rodriguez. I was one of the paramedics who responded to your call on Saturday." Kali's heart began to race. She'd been thinking about Janet constantly since the hospital, wondering what the paramedic had heard and what she thought about the obvious discrepancies in David's story. "How did you find my address?" "Emergency contact information from your medical forms," Janet admitted, looking comfortable. "I know this is irregular, but I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I've never been able to forget what I heard your father say that day. I think you deserve to know the truth about your family." Janet was in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of weathered face that came from years of responding to other people's crises. But her eyes were kind, and there was something in her manner that made Kali feel safe, despite the unexpected visit. "What truth?" Kali asked, stepping aside to let Janet into her small Capitol Hill apartment, ironically, only 6 blocks from where David lived. Janet sat down heavily on Kali's couch, the manila envelope balanced on her knees. "Your father mentioned another scandal and something about what happened to your brother. But Marcus is only brother David, which means he was talking about something else entirely." Kali's heart began to race. She'd been thinking about Janet constantly since the hospital, wondering what the paramedic had heard and what she thought about the obvious discrepancies in David's story. "I noticed that too, but I thought maybe I misheard." "You didn't mishear," Janet said firmly, "and I think I know what he was referring to." She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photocopied newspaper articles, some of them yellowed with age. The first article was dated 15 years earlier from the Seattle Times. The headline read, "Local developer's son dies in apparent suicide." Kali's hands trembled as she read the subheading. 22-year-old Michael Finley found dead in family home. Father calls for privacy during investigation. "Michael?" Kali whispered. "I don't understand. My father never mentioned having another brother." Janet's expression was grim. "Keep reading." The article was brief, clearly written during the initial investigation before all the facts were known. It described how Michael Finley, the eldest son of real estate mogul Richard Finley, had been found dead in his childhood bedroom at the family's Bellevue estate. The death was being investigated as a possible suicide, though the article noted that the investigation was ongoing. Kali's mind reeled. Her grandfather Richard had died when she was 10, but she'd never heard any mention of an uncle named Michael. As far as she knew, Marcus only had one brother, David. How could an entire person just be erased from the family history? "There's more," Janet said gently, handing her another article dated a week later. This one was smaller, buried on page 6 of the local section. "Developer's son death ruled suicide. Family requests privacy." But the third article is what made Kali's blood run cold.
This one was from 3 months after Michael's death, and he was barely 2 paragraphs long. Investigation into Finley family death reveals history of abuse, no charges filed. According to the brief report, the police investigation into Michael Finley's suicide had uncovered evidence of, quote, long-term physical and emotional abuse within the family, unquote. The article mentioned that both Michael and his younger brother David had provided statements to investigators about their father Richard's violent behavior, but that no charges would be filed due to the statute of limitations and Richard Finley's cooperation with authorities in seeking treatment. This is impossible, Kali breathed as she set down the articles. My grandfather was gentle. He taught me to play chess. He told me stories. Abusers rarely show their true face to everyone, Janet said softly, especially not to grandchildren. But this explains so much about your Uncle David's behavior, doesn't it? The drinking, the anger, the instability. It did explain things, but it also raised terrifying new questions. If my father knew about the abuse, if he gave statements to the police, then why didn't he protect Michael? Why didn't you get him help? Janet pulled out another document, this one a photocopy of what appears to be a police report. According to this, Marcus was away at college when most of the abuse occurred. He was 8 years older than Michael, 12 years older than David. By the time he graduated and came back to Seattle, Michael was already spiraling. Kali studied the report, trying to process the information. Marcus would have been 26 when Michael died, just starting his own real estate business. He'd have been focused on building his career, possibly unaware of the extent of what was happening at home. But he knew something, she said, remembering her father's urgent whisper at the hospital. He said the family couldn't handle another scandal. He was talking about this. That's what I think too, Janet agreed, and that's why I'm here. Because I've seen this pattern before, Kali. Families that prioritize reputation over truth, that sweep abuse under the rug to protect their image. It doesn't end well.
Janet told Kali about other cases she'd responded to over the years. Domestic violence situations where family members had begged victims not to press charges. Sexual assault cases where parents had convinced their children that reporting the crime would destroy the family. In every case, the silence had only enabled more abuse. I've been thinking about your situation for 3 days, Janet continued. Your Uncle David didn't just assault you randomly. He specifically mentioned your grandfather, said your father knew about it and never stopped it. He's carrying decades of unprocessed trauma, and now he's acting it out. The realization hit Kali like a physical blow. You think he'll do it again? I think he's escalating, Janet said bluntly, and I think your father's response, immediately trying to cover it up, just like they covered up Michael's suicide, shows that this family has learned all the wrong lessons from their past. Kali stood up abruptly, pacing to her kitchen window that looked out over the Seattle skyline. In the distance, she could see several of the luxury buildings her father had developed, gleaming towers that had made the Finley name synonymous with success and prosperity. But now those buildings felt like monuments to a lie. "What am I supposed to do with this information?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's up to you, but I will tell you this. I've seen what happens when families choose silence over truth. The abuse doesn't stop. It just finds new victims." Janet explained that she'd looked up Kali's background as well, had learned about her degree in social work and her job at the nonprofit organization. You work with at-risk youth, right? Kids who've been abused, neglected, abandoned by the system? Kali nodded, still staring out the window. Then you know better than most people that secrets protect perpetrators, not victims. Your Uncle Michael couldn't live with what happened to him, and your Uncle David is slowly destroying himself with alcohol and rage. How many more people have to be hurt before someone in your family decides that the truth matters more than appearances? When Kali finally turned back to face Janet, there were tears streaming down her cheeks. "My mother," she said suddenly. "She asked me if it was really just a fall. She suspects something." "She probably suspects a lot of things," Janet said gently. "Women in families like yours often know more than they're allowed to say." Over the next hour, Janet shared more details from her research. She'd found Michael's obituary, which mentioned his love of photography,
the same passion that David had once pursued. She discovered that Richard Finley had indeed sought treatment after the investigation, attending anger management courses and family therapy, but only for 6 months before declaring himself cured. Most disturbing of all, she'd found records of 3 domestic violence calls to the Finley family home in the 2 years before Michael's death. In each case, no arrests had been made and no charges had been filed. The family's wealth and reputation had protected them from consequences. Your grandfather died of a heart attack 8 years after Michael's suicide. By then, your father had taken over the business, married your mother, and started building the public image of the perfect family. David was already drinking heavily and struggling to hold down jobs. The pattern was set. As Janet prepared to leave, she handed Kali a business card. I want you to know that whatever you decide to do, you don't have to do it alone. I've seen families break these cycles of abuse and secrecy, but it takes courage. The card wasn't for the paramedic service where Janet worked. Instead, it read, Sound Recovery Alliance, with Janet's name listed as a volunteer coordinator. I do crisis counseling in my spare time, for families dealing with trauma, addiction, and abuse. I started volunteering there after my own brother died by suicide when I was your age. His death was the result of childhood sexual abuse that our family never addressed, never reported, never talked about. Kali looked up sharply. That's why you came here tonight. It's not just about doing the right thing, it's personal. Everything is personal when you're dealing with family trauma. The question is whether you're going to let that trauma control your family's future or whether you're going to take control of it yourself. After Janet left, Kali sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the photocopied articles and police reports. She thought about Michael, the uncle she'd never known existed, who'd taken his own life rather than continue living with the pain of what had been done to him. She thought about David, drowning his trauma in alcohol and lashing out at the people who reminded him of his powerlessness. She thought about her father, who'd witnessed the destruction of his family and had chosen to respond by building walls of secrecy and respectability. And she thought about herself, a social worker who dedicated her career to helping vulnerable young people who had somehow remained blind to the vulnerability in her own family. The catalyst had been planted. The truth about the Finley family's past was no longer buried, and Kali knew that she had a choice to make. She could follow her father's example and keep the family's secrets quiet, preserving the illusion of perfection that had been so carefully constructed. Or she could choose a different path, one that honored Michael's memory, acknowledged David's pain, and broke the cycle of silence that had already claimed too much. As she finally went to bed that night, Kali knew that her decision would change everything, not just for herself, but for everyone who carried the Finley name.
The confrontation Kali had been dreading came sooner than expected. She'd barely had time to process Janet's revelations when her phone rang at 6:30 the next morning. It was her mother, Rebecca, and her voice was strained with barely controlled panic. Kali, sweetheart, you need to come to the house right away. There's been a situation with David and your father, well, he's not handling it well. 30 minutes later, Kali pulled into the circular driveway of her childhood home in Bellevue, the imposing Tudor mansion where she'd grown up believing in fairy tales. Now, looking at the perfectly manicured gardens and elegant stone facade, all she could think about was Michael, the uncle who died in one of those upstairs bedrooms while the family maintained their pristine image. She found her parents in the kitchen, a room that had always been the heart of their home. Rebecca was making coffee with shaking hands, while Marcus paced back and forth, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His tie was askew, his hair uncombed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. "What happened?" Kali asked, settling into one of the breakfast nook chairs where she'd eaten countless bowls of cereal before school. "David was arrested last night," Marcus said without preamble. "Bar fight at O'Malley's pub. He put some guy in the hospital, fractured skull, broken ribs. The victim is pressing charges." Kali's heart sank. Janet's prediction about escalation was already coming true. Is he okay? Physically, yes. Mentally and legally, that's another story.
Marcus finally stopped casing and fixed Kali with a look she'd never seen before, equal parts desperate and calculating. The police are calling it aggravated assault. He's looking at serious prison time unless we can figure something out. Rebecca set down 3 coffee mugs, her movements precise despite her obvious distress. The worst part is what he was saying when they arrested him. About the family, about your grandfather, about... She glanced at Marcus nervously. About what happened on Saturday, Marcus finished grimly. He was drunk, ranting about family secrets and how everyone was going to pay for what we'd covered up. Half the bar heard him talking about Michael. The name hung in the air like a curse. Kali watched her parents' faces carefully, noting how they both flinched at the mention of her grandfather's eldest son. "So you both knew about Michael," she said quietly. The question landed like a bomb in the perfect kitchen. Marcus went completely still while Rebecca's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. "How do you know that name?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously low. Kali had prepared for this moment, but actually facing her father's anger was more intimidating than she had anticipated. The paramedic who responded to my call, Janet Rodriguez, she did some research. She found newspaper articles, police reports. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, and finally a kind of cold fury that reminded Kali uncomfortably of her grandfather's photos. That woman had no right to involve herself in our private family business, none whatsoever. "She had every right," Kali replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "She witnessed you trying to cover up what David did to me, just like the family covered up what happened to Michael." "You don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca interjected, but her voice lacked conviction. "Michael's death was tragic, but it had nothing to do with what happened to you." "Doesn't it?" Kali pulled out the photocopied articles Janet had given her, spreading them across the granite countertop. "Michael died by suicide after years of abuse. David is acting out his trauma by hurting other people. And when David assaulted me, Dad's first instinct was to make sure no one found out. How is that not connected?" Marcus snatched up the articles, his hands trembling with rage. "Where did you get these? This is private family business that died with my father." "It didn't die, Dad. It's been festering for 15 years, and now it's poisoning everything it touches." What followed was the most brutal argument of Kali's life. Marcus accused her of betraying the family, of airing dirty laundry to strangers, of being naive about how the world worked. He explained in cutting detail how Richard Finley's business had supported not just her immediate family, but dozens of employees and their families, how Michael's suicide had nearly destroyed everything they had built. "I spent years rebuilding this family's reputation," Marcus said, his voice rising. "Years proving that we were more than one man's mistakes. And you want to tear all of that down for what? Some misguided justice?" "For the truth. And to stop David from hurting anyone else." Rebecca, meanwhile, revealed layers of complicity that Kali had never suspected. She admitted to knowing about Richard's violent temper, about the police calls, about Michael's deteriorating mental health in the months before his death. But she was young when she married Marcus, overwhelmed by the wealth and status of the Finley family, and terrified of losing her place in their world. "You have to understand," Rebecca pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "When I married your father, I thought I was getting a fairy tale. The beautiful house, the financial security, the social standing. By the time I realized what the family had been through, I already had you to think about. I couldn't risk destroying your future." "So you chose to pretend Michael never existed?" "We chose to focus on the future instead of dwelling on the past," Marcus corrected sharply. "We built something good from something terrible. We gave you opportunities that Michael and David never had." The conversation grew increasingly heated as Kali pressed for more details. She learned that Michael had tried multiple times to get help. Therapy, addiction treatment, even a brief hospitalization for depression. But each time he'd made progress, something would trigger him back into despair. The final trigger, according to David's statement to police, had been Richard's refusal to acknowledge the abuse during a family dinner, followed by a threat to cut Michael off financially if he continued spreading lies. "David found him the next morning," Rebecca whispered. "He'd hanged himself in his childhood bedroom, right next to his old photography equipment. David was only 26, and he blamed himself for not doing more to help." Marcus was furious that Rebecca had revealed even that much detail. "This is exactly why we don't talk about this. It serves no purpose except to cause more pain." But Kali was beginning to understand the true scope of her family's dysfunction. David hadn't just lost a brother, he'd lost his only ally in a family that had taught him to be silent about his own trauma. No wonder he'd turned to alcohol. No wonder he'd struggled with relationships and employment. He'd been carrying the weight of Michael's death along with his own unprocessed abuse for 15 years. The argument reached its peak when Marcus tried to forbid Kali from having any further contact with Janet Rodriguez or anyone else who might exploit their family's pain. He threatened to cut her off financially, to use his business connections to damage her career, even to contest their family trust if she continued this destructive path. "You're just like your grandfather," Kali said finally, the words escaping before she could stop them, "using fear and control to keep people quiet." The comparison hit Marcus like a physical blow. For a moment, he looked genuinely stricken, and Kali caught a glimpse of the scared young man who'd lost 2 brothers to their father's legacy of violence. But then his expression hardened again. "Get out of my house, and don't come back until you're ready to act like a member of this family." As Kali gathered her things to leave, Rebecca followed her to the front door. "He doesn't mean it," she said urgently. "He's scared and angry, but he loves you. We both do." "Then prove it. Help me get David the help he needs instead of just managing the scandal." But Rebecca's response revealed the depth of her own fears. "You don't understand what you're asking. If David talks about the family history, if this becomes public knowledge, it won't just hurt your father's business. It could affect your inheritance, your future children's opportunities, everything we've built." "And what about David's future? What about the people he might hurt if we don't address this?" Rebecca's silence was answer enough. As Kali drove away from her childhood home, she felt the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. 3 generations of Finley men had learned to deal with trauma through silence, control, and the accumulation of wealth and status. The women in the family, first her grandmother, then Rebecca, and now supposedly Kali herself, were expected to support the system by keeping quiet about anything that might threaten it. But Kali had spent her career working with young people who'd been failed by similar systems of silence and complicity. She'd seen what happened when adults prioritized institutional reputation over individual safety. She'd counseled teenagers who'd been sexually abused by family members while other relatives looked the other way. She'd worked with kids who'd aged out of foster care because their birth families had been more concerned with avoiding scandal than addressing abuse. The irony wasn't lost on her that she dedicated her professional life to fighting the very patterns that governed her own family. That evening, she called Janet Rodriguez. "You were right about the escalation," she said without preamble. "David was arrested for assault last night. He put someone in the hospital." "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not surprised," Janet replied gently. "How are your parents handling it?" Kali described the morning's confrontation, the threats, the demand that she choose between family loyalty and personal integrity. Janet listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding. "The resistance phase is always the hardest," Janet said when Kali finished. "When you start threatening a family's established narrative, they'll fight back with everything they have. But you need to ask yourself, what's the cost of backing down now?" Kali knew the answer. If she gave in to her parents' demands, David would continue his downward spiral until he seriously hurt someone or destroyed himself completely. The family's pattern of covering up abuse and trauma would continue into the next generation. And somewhere down the line, there would be other victims, maybe David's future partners, maybe children who weren't yet born, maybe other family members who found themselves on the wrong side of the Finley family's need for control. "What's the cost of moving forward?" she asked. "Probably everything you've taken for granted about your family," Janet replied honestly. but also the possibility of breaking a cycle that's already claimed 2 lives and is working on a 3rd. As Kali hung up the phone, she realized that the resistance she was facing wasn't just from her parents. Part of her own mind was rebelling against the path she was choosing, desperate to return to the comfortable illusions of her childhood. It would be so much easier to apologize to Marcus, to promise to keep quiet about Michael and David's history, to accept her role as the next generation's keeper of family secrets. But every time she considered backing down, she thought about Michael's photographs gathering dust in a storage unit somewhere, about David's pain-filled eyes as he'd struck her, about all the young people she'd worked with who'd never had anyone willing to fight for the truth about their abuse. The resistance was strong, but her commitment to breaking the cycle was stronger.
The King County Jail visiting room was nothing like the sterile, intimidating spaces Kali had seen in movies. Instead, it felt more like a depressing school cafeteria. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, plastic chairs arranged around metal tables, and the constant background noise of hushed conversations between inmates and their visitors. Kali sat nervously at table 7, waiting for David to be brought out, unsure of what she would say to the man who had assaulted her just a week earlier. She'd made the decision to visit David against everyone's advice. Her parents had been horrified when she'd called to tell them. Janet had expressed concern about her safety, and even her supervisor at the nonprofit, Maria Santos, had questioned whether it was wise to engage directly with her attacker. But Kali knew that if she was going to break her family's cycle of silence and avoidance, she had to start by facing the truth about David's situation head on. When David shuffled into the visiting room wearing an orange jumpsuit, he looked smaller and more fragile than she remembered. The arrogance and rage that had frightened her in his apartment were gone, replaced by something that looked like shame mixed with resignation. His hands were cuffed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "I didn't expect you to come," he said quietly as he settled into the chair across from her, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't expect to come either," Kali admitted. "But I've been learning some things about our family that I think you and I need to talk about." For the first time since he'd sat down, David looked directly at her. There was surprise in his expression, followed by something that might have been hope. "What kind of things?" "About Michael. About what really happened to him and what happened to you." David's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy he'd once been, the youngest Finley son who'd been left behind when Marcus went to college, who'd witnessed things no child should see, who'd found his older brother's body and blamed himself for not preventing the suicide. Over the next hour, David told Kali the full story of their grandfather's abuse, filling in details that hadn't been in the police reports or in newspaper articles. He described the unpredictable rages, the way Richard would explode over trivial infractions, a glass of spilled milk, a B+ on a report card, the sound of children laughing too loudly. He talked about how Michael had tried to shield David from the worst of it, often drawing their father's attention to himself when David was in danger. "Michael saved me more times than I can count," David said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He'd deliberately break something or talk back when he could see Dad getting ready to go after me. He knew he'd get beat for it, but he did it anyway." The guilt David carried wasn't just survivor's guilt. It was the specific anguish of someone who'd been protected by a person who ultimately couldn't protect himself. When Michael's depression had deepened in his early 20s, David had tried to return the favor, but he'd been too young and too damaged himself to provide the kind of help Michael needed. "I knew he was getting worse," David continued. "He'd stopped eating regularly, stopped caring about his photography. Sometimes I'd find him just sitting in his room, staring at nothing. But when I tried to talk to him about it, he'd just tell me he was fine and change the subject." The night before Michael's suicide, David had found him in their father's old study, going through boxes of family photographs. Michael had been cutting himself out of picture after picture, methodically removing his image from family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was
cleaning up loose ends. I thought he meant he was organizing Dad's stuff, maybe getting ready to throw some things away. I didn't realize. David's voice broke completely. Kali reached across the table and covered David's cuffed hands with her own. It was a gesture that would have been impossible a week earlier, but learning about their shared family trauma had shifted something fundamental in how she saw him. He wasn't just her attacker, he was also a victim of the same system of abuse and silence that had destroyed Michael. "It's not your fault that Michael died," she said firmly. "You were 26 years old, dealing with your own trauma, and the family had taught both of you that you weren't supposed to talk about what happened. How could you have known how to help him when no one had ever taught you how to help yourself?" David looked up at her with an expression of desperate gratitude. "Marcus always said I should have seen the signs, should have done something. He made it sound like I was responsible for not stopping it." This revelation about her father's blame shifting added another layer to Kali's understanding of the family dynamics. Marcus had dealt with his own guilt about Michael's death by placing responsibility on David, the person who was physically present but emotionally least equipped to handle the crisis. It was a cruel distortion of responsibility that likely contributed to David's drinking and instability. "Marcus was wrong," Kali said, "and I think he knows it, but it's easier to blame you than to face his own role in what happened." They talked about the assault in David's apartment, and David's account matched what Kali remembered, but provided crucial context she'd been missing. The furniture moving request hadn't been random. David had been trying to clear out his apartment because his landlord was evicting him for unpaid rent and noise complaints from neighbors. He was facing homelessness on top of everything else, and his already fragile mental state had reached a breaking point.
"When you started talking about being fortunate and having opportunities, it felt like you were rubbing my face in everything I'd lost," David explained. "I know that's not what you meant, but in that moment, all I could think about was how Michael never got those chances and how I'd wasted every opportunity I'd been given because I couldn't get past what happened to us." David also revealed that his drinking had escalated significantly in recent months because he'd been having nightmares about Michael. Vivid dreams where his brother was asking why David hadn't saved him, why he'd let their father hurt him, why he'd survived when Michael hadn't. The assault on Kali had happened during one of the worst periods of sleep deprivation and alcohol abuse David had experienced since Michael's death. "I kept thinking about how you work with kids who've been hurt, how you've made something good out of your life," David continued, "and I hated you for it because I couldn't figure out how to make anything good out of mine. But I also hated myself for hating you because you didn't deserve that." As they talked, Kali began to see the possibility of a different path forward, one that didn't require choosing between protecting her family's reputation and getting David the help he needed. Instead of viewing David's legal troubles as a crisis to be managed, what if they approached them as an opportunity for healing and accountability? "I want to help you," she told David, "but not the way the family usually helps each other, not by covering things up or making problems disappear. I want to help you get real treatment for your trauma and addiction, and I want you to take responsibility for what you did to me and to the man you hurt at the bar." David was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. "You mean like therapy and rehab and stuff?" "I mean comprehensive treatment that addresses the root causes of your behavior, not just the symptoms. And I mean being honest with the court about your mental health struggles while still accepting the consequences for your actions." This conversation marked the beginning of Kali's commitment to a radically different approach to her family's problems. Instead of following the established pattern of silence and damage control, she was choosing to engage directly with the trauma that had been poisoning her family for decades. Over the following days, Kali threw herself into research and planning with the same intensity she brought to her most challenging cases at work. She contacted several mental health professionals who specialized in treating adult survivors of childhood abuse, researched residential treatment programs that combined addiction recovery with trauma therapy,
and even reached out to victim advocacy organizations to better understand the legal process David would be facing. Her supervisor, Maria, proved to be an unexpected ally in this process. When Kali explained the situation during their weekly supervision meeting, Maria's response was both professional and deeply personal. "I grew up in a family that dealt with trauma by pretending it didn't exist. My father was an alcoholic who became violent when he drank, but we were taught that family business stayed in the family. It took me years of therapy to understand that protecting family secrets isn't the same thing as protecting family members." Maria helped Kali navigate the ethical considerations of being personally involved in a situation that intersected with her professional expertise. She also connected Kali with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in what she called intergenerational trauma recovery, helping families break cycles of abuse and dysfunction that had been passed down from multiple generations. Dr. Chen's approach was exactly what Kali had been looking for. Instead of focusing solely on individual therapy, she worked with entire family systems to identify and change the patterns that enabled abuse to continue. She'd had success with families dealing with everything from childhood sexual abuse to domestic violence to military trauma that had been passed down from generation to generation. The Finley family pattern is unfortunately common, Dr. Chen explained during their initial consultation. A patriarch with untreated trauma creates an environment of fear and violence. The children develop different coping strategies. Some become hypervigilant and controlling, like your father. Others self-medicate with substances, like David. And still others try to escape through achievements, like Michael's photography. But without addressing the underlying trauma, these coping strategies often become destructive in their own right. Dr. Chen also explained that Kali's decision to break the family's pattern of silence was both courageous and risky. Families have powerful immune systems. When one member starts changing the established dynamics, the rest of the family will often increase pressure to maintain the status quo. You need to be prepared for escalating resistance. But Dr. Chen also offered hope. She'd worked with families who'd successfully broken multi-generational patterns of abuse and secrecy, and she believed that the Finley family had several factors working in their favor. David's willingness to engage with treatment was crucial, as was Kali's professional understanding of trauma dynamics. Even Marcus and Rebecca's obvious love for Kali, despite their resistance to change, could be potentially leveraged for positive outcomes. The key, Dr. Chen explained, is creating new patterns of accountability and healing while maintaining the family connections that are worth preserving. It's not about destroying your family. It's about helping your family become healthier. As Kali left Dr. Chen's office, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Janet Rodriguez had first appeared on her doorstep: hope. For the first time, she could envision a future where David got the help he needed, where her parents could acknowledge their family history without being destroyed by it, and where Michael's death could serve as a catalyst for healing rather than just another family secret to be buried and forgotten. The commitment was made. Instead of choosing between family loyalty and personal integrity, Kali was choosing to redefine what family loyalty actually meant. She was going to fight for her family by fighting against the patterns that had been slowly destroying them for decades. But as Dr. Chen had warned, the real challenges were just beginning.
The Pierce County Courthouse was an imposing concrete structure that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inspire confidence in justice. As Kali walked through the metal detectors on a cold November morning, she clutched a manila folder containing letters from Dr. Chen, medical records from David's emergency psychiatric evaluation, and her own carefully written victim impact statement, a document that had taken her 3 weeks to complete and would likely change her family forever. Today was David's sentencing hearing, and Kali was about to do something that no one in her family had ever done before: tell the complete truth in a public forum about the Finley family's history of abuse and trauma. The events leading up to this moment had unfolded with devastating speed. 3 weeks earlier, David had accepted a plea bargain for the bar assault, agreeing to plead guilty to second-degree assault in exchange for a sentence that would include mandatory mental health treatment. It should have been a straightforward legal proceeding,
But nothing involving the Finley family was ever straightforward. Marcus had hired one of Seattle's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, Jonathan Whitmore, with explicit instructions to minimize David's sentence and keep family details out of the public record. Whitmore's strategy was simple: portray David as a man who'd made a mistake while struggling with alcoholism, emphasize his lack of prior violent convictions, and push for a lenient sentence with minimal publicity. But Kali's decision to provide a comprehensive victim impact statement, one that detailed not just David's assault on her, but the generational patterns of abuse that had led to it, had thrown that strategy into chaos. "You can't do this," Marcus had pleaded during their last phone conversation. "Do you understand what you are about to destroy? Not just David's future, but the family's entire reputation. My business relationships, your mother's social standing, your own career prospects, all of it will be ruined." What about the people David might hurt if we don't address the real problem? What about honoring Michael's memory by making sure his death meant something? The conversation had ended with Marcus hanging up on her, but not before making one final threat: "If you go through with this, you're not my daughter anymore." Now, sitting in the courtroom's gallery section, Kali could see the aftermath of that threat playing out in real time. Marcus and Rebecca sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, flanked by Whitmore and 2 associates. They hadn't spoken to Kali in 3 weeks, hadn't returned her calls, and they'd made it clear through intermediaries that she was no longer welcome at family gatherings or business events. But Kali wasn't alone. Janet Rodriguez sat beside her, having taken a personal day to provide moral support. Dr. Chen was also present, prepared to testify as an expert witness about intergenerational trauma if the judge requested additional context. Even Maria Santos had come, representing the broader community of professionals who believe that breaking cycles of abuse required courage and public accountability. The hearing began with routine procedural matters: the reading of charges, confirmation of David's plea, and presentation of the prosecution's sentencing recommendation. David, wearing an ill-fitting suit that his court-appointed attorney had borrowed from a colleague, looked pale and nervous, but alert. He'd been sober for nearly a month while in custody, and the difference in his appearance was striking. Then came the victim impact statements, starting with the man David had assaulted at O'Malley's pub. Tommy Morrison was a 34-year-old construction worker who'd been drinking with friends after completing a major project. His statement was brief but powerful, describing the ongoing headaches and memory problems he'd experienced since suffering a fractured skull, as well as the financial hardship his family had endured during his recovery. "I've never seen rage like what I saw in David Finley's eyes that night. It wasn't just about our argument over the pool table. It was like he was fighting demons I couldn't see, and I just happened to be in the way." Tommy's willingness to show compassion, even while seeking accountability, impressed the judge, but it was Kali's statement that transformed the entire proceeding. She began by describing David's assault on her, providing details that hadn't been included in the police report because the incident had initially been covered up. She talked about the fear she'd experienced, the physical pain of her injuries, and the psychological impact of being attacked by someone she trusted and loved. But then she did something unprecedented in her family's history. She provided context. "Your Honor, I need you to understand that what David did to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest manifestation of a pattern of trauma and abuse that has been destroying my family for decades." Over the next 20 minutes, Kali laid out the complete story of the Finley family's dysfunction. She described her grandfather Richard's violent abuse of his sons, the family's decision to cover up that abuse even as it escalated, and Michael's eventual suicide when the trauma became unbearable. She explained how David had been carrying survivor's guilt and unprocessed trauma for 15 years, how the family's pattern of silence had prevented him from getting the help he needed, and how their current crisis represented both a tragedy and an opportunity.
"I'm not asking you to excuse what David did," Kali said, looking directly at Judge Patricia Hamilton. "Violence is never acceptable, regardless of its underlying causes. But I am asking you to understand that punishment without treatment will only perpetuate the cycle that led us here." The courtroom was completely silent as Kali concluded her statement. She could see Marcus gripping the edge of his seat, his face a mask of fury and despair. Rebecca was crying quietly,
And even Whitmore looked stunned by the comprehensiveness of Kali's revelations. But the most dramatic moment came when Judge Hamilton asked David if he wanted to respond to the victim impact statements. Under normal circumstances, defendants offered brief apologies and expressed remorse for their actions. David's response was anything but typical. "Your Honor," David said, standing with obvious effort, "everything my niece just told you is true. I've spent 15 years trying to drink away the memory of finding my brother's body, trying to forget the things my father did to us, trying to pretend that none of it affected who I became. But it affected everything." David's voice grew steadier as he continued, and for the first time since Kali had known him, he seemed completely present and clear-headed. "I hurt Kali because she reminded me of possibilities I thought I'd lost forever. I hurt Mr. Morrison because I was angry at ghosts he had nothing to do with. And I've been hurting myself for so long that I forgot there might be another way to live." Then, David did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom, including his own attorney. He rejected the plea bargain's sentencing recommendation and asked for a harsher sentence that would include longer-term residential treatment. "I don't want the minimum sentence," he told the judge. "I want whatever sentence will give me the best chance of becoming the person my brother Michael believed I could be, and the uncle that Kali deserved to have." The legal implications of David's statement threw the proceeding into temporary chaos. Whitmore requested an immediate recess to consult with his client, but David refused to change his position. He wanted accountability, not just damage control. Judge Hamilton, a seasoned jurist who'd been on the bench for 15 years, later said that David's case was one of the most complex she'd ever encountered. The intersection of family trauma, mental health issues, and criminal behavior created a situation that couldn't be resolved through standard sentencing guidelines. After a 2-hour recess, during which court-appointed mental health professionals conducted an additional evaluation of David's fitness to make such a significant legal decision, Judge Hamilton rendered her verdict. David was sentenced to 18 months in state prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and mandatory participation in a residential trauma treatment program. The sentence was harsher than the original plea bargain recommended, but it included comprehensive mental health services and family counseling components that addressed the underlying causes of David's behavior. More significantly, Judge Hamilton ordered the court record to remain public, meaning that Kali's victim impact statement and David's response would become part of the permanent legal record. The Finley family secrets were now matters of public documentation. The immediate aftermath of the sentencing was brutal. Marcus and Rebecca left the courthouse without speaking to Kali, and within hours, local news outlets had picked up the story. Prominent developer's brother sentenced in assault case, family history of abuse revealed, ran as the lead story on 3 Seattle news websites by that evening. But there were also unexpected positive developments. Tommy Morrison approached Kali after the hearing to thank her for her honesty and to express hope that David would get the help he needed. Several members of the courtroom gallery, strangers who'd been there for other cases but had stayed to listen to the unusual proceedings, approached her with their own stories of family trauma and cover-ups. Most importantly, Dr. Chen confirmed that David's willingness to accept responsibility and seek intensive treatment significantly improved his chances for genuine recovery. "This is what breakthrough looks like," she told Kali as they walked out of the courthouse together. "It's messy and painful and public, but it's real change happening in real time." That evening, Kali sat in her apartment surrounded by newspaper clippings, legal documents, and messages from friends and colleagues who'd heard about the day's events. Some were supportive, praising her courage and integrity. Others were critical, questioning whether she'd done the right thing by exposing private family matters in such a public way. But the message that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Janet Rodriguez, the paramedic who'd started this entire journey by refusing to let the Finley family's pattern of cover-ups continue unchallenged. "You did something today that most people never find the courage to do. You chose truth over comfort,
healing over reputation, and accountability over denial. Your Uncle Michael would be proud. As Kali prepared for bed that night, she realized that the first trial was over, but the real test was just beginning. David's recovery would take years, not months. Her relationship with her parents might never fully heal. The public scrutiny of her family's private pain would continue for the foreseeable future. But for the first time since this journey began, Kali felt like she was moving in the right direction, towards truth, towards healing, and towards a future where the Finley family name might represent something other than perfectly maintained secrets and carefully hidden shame. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in December, exactly 6 weeks after David's sentencing. Kali was in her office at the youth center, reviewing case files for her afternoon appointments, when her secretary knocked on the door with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "There's someone here to see you," Amanda said quietly. "She says she's your aunt, but she's not on your approved visitor list. Her name is Patricia Finley Chen." The name hit Kali like an electric shock. She'd never heard of any Patricia in her family, and the hyphenated surname suggested a married woman who'd kept part of her maiden name. But before she could process the implications, a woman in her mid-50s appeared in the doorway behind Amanda. Patricia was unmistakably a Findley. She had the same angular facial structure as Marcus and David, the same deep-set blue eyes that Kali saw in her own mirror. But there was something softer about her, a gentleness in her expression that seemed foreign to the Finley family dynamic. "Kali, meow." "I'm sorry to ambush you like this," Patricia said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "But after what happened at David's sentencing, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I'm Richard Finley's daughter, your father's sister." The revelation that she had another aunt, a third sibling who'd somehow been erased from family history even more completely than Michael, left Kali speechless. Patricia seemed to understand her shock and confusion. "I know this is overwhelming," she continued. "Could we talk privately? There are things about our family that you need to know, things that didn't come up in the court proceedings." Over the next 2 hours, Patricia Finley Chen unraveled another layer of the Finley family's complex history of secrets and trauma. She was the eldest of Richard's 4 children, born 2 years before Marcus, and she'd escaped the family's dysfunction by running away at age 17, 35 years ago. "I was the first one our father turned his violence on. By the time Marcus was old enough to be a target, I'd learned how to draw Dad's attention away from him, but I paid the price for protecting my little brothers." Patricia's story was harrowing. As the only daughter in a family where Richard viewed females as inherently inferior, she endured not just physical abuse, but systematic psychological degradation designed to break her spirit. She'd been forbidden from participating in school activities, denied medical care when she was injured, and constantly told that her only value was in eventually marrying someone who could benefit the family business. The breaking point came when I was 16 and Dad tried to arrange a marriage for me. He'd made a deal with one of his business partners, a man in his 40s who was looking for a young wife. I was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity. Instead of submitting to the arranged marriage, Patricia had spent months secretly planning her escape. She'd saved money from a part-time job her father didn't know about, applied to colleges using a friend's address, and gradually moved her belongings out of the house. The night before the engagement party Richard had planned, she'd disappeared. I left a letter for Marcus, Michael, and David explaining why I had to go. I told them that I loved them, but that staying would destroy me, and that I hoped they'd find their own ways out when they were old enough. I never expected the family to pretend I'd never existed. Patricia had indeed made a new life for herself, earning a degree in education and eventually becoming a high school guidance counselor in Portland, Oregon. She'd married Daniel Chen, a social worker she'd met in college, and they'd raised 3 children who knew nothing about their mother's original family.
For 35 years, she'd maintained no contact with the Finleys, believing that her brothers were better off without the complication of her presence. But the news coverage of David's sentencing had shattered that assumption. Seeing her youngest brother's face in the newspaper, reading about Michael's suicide and the family's history of covering up abuse, had convinced Patricia that her long silence might have contributed to the tragedies that followed her escape. I kept telling myself that leaving was the brave thing to do, but watching David destroy himself, learning that Michael killed himself, seeing what this family's secrets have done to you, I realized that maybe I just took the easy way out. Patricia's return brought with it a wealth of information that recontextualized everything Kali thought she knew about her family's dynamics. She learned that Marcus's decision to go to college across the country wasn't about pursuing educational opportunities. It was a desperate escape from a situation he couldn't handle. He'd left for Stanford knowing that his departure would leave Michael and David more vulnerable to their father's violence, and that guilt had shaped every decision he'd made since then.
Marcus built his successful business partly as a way to prove he wasn't like Dad, Patricia said, but he also built it as a fortress, something that would give the family enough money and power to avoid ever being vulnerable again. The problem is that fortress mentality also meant keeping secrets and controlling information. Patricia's perspective on Michael's suicide was particularly illuminating. She revealed that Michael had actually tried to contact her several times in the months before his death, using private investigator services to track down her address in Portland. He'd sent her letters describing his struggles with depression and his desperate need to understand whether their father's abuse had permanently damaged him. "I never responded to his letters," Patricia admitted, her voice breaking completely. "I was terrified that any contact with the family would drag me back into that world of violence and chaos. I thought I was protecting my own children by maintaining the separation. But Michael needed to know that it was possible to survive what Dad did to us, and I wasn't there to tell him." This revelation cast Michael's death in a new light. Rather than being an isolated tragedy caused by untreated mental illness, his suicide began to look like the result of a family system that had abandoned him to face his trauma alone. Marcus had been emotionally unavailable, focused on building his business empire. Patricia had been physically and emotionally absent, protecting her own recovery. David had been too young and too damaged to provide the support Michael needed. But Patricia's return also brought hope. Her successful escape and recovery proved that it was possible to break free from the family's destructive patterns. She'd created a healthy marriage, raised 3 well-adjusted children, and built a career helping young people navigate their own difficult circumstances. "The reason I became a guidance counselor," Patricia explained, "was because I never wanted another kid to feel as alone and helpless as I felt in that house. I've spent 35 years helping teenagers figure out how to survive family dysfunction and plan for better futures." Patricia's professional expertise proved invaluable as Kali struggled with the aftermath of her own decisions. She understood both the courage required to break family silence and the complex grief that came with losing family relationships in the process. "What you did in that courtroom was extraordinary," Patricia told her, "but you need to prepare yourself for a long, difficult journey. When you expose a family's core secrets, you're not just changing your own life, you're forcing everyone in the system to confront truths they've spent years avoiding." Over the following weeks, Patricia became an unexpected mentor and ally. She helped Kali understand the psychological dynamics that had driven her father's desperate need for control, provided context for her mother's complicity and fear, and offered strategies for maintaining her own emotional health while the family system underwent massive upheaval. But Patricia's presence also created new complications. When Marcus learned that his long-lost sister had not only returned, but was actively supporting Kali's efforts to address the family's dysfunction, his response was swift and brutal. Through their attorney, Marcus and Rebecca filed a restraining order against both Kali and Patricia, claiming that their harassment and public defamation was causing severe emotional distress and threatening the family's financial stability. The legal filing was clearly designed more to intimidate than to succeed in court, but it formalized the complete breakdown of family relationships. "This is what desperation looks like," Patricia explained when they received the court papers. "Marcus has spent 30 years building an identity based on being nothing like our father, but now he's using the same tactics Dad used: intimidation, control, and attempts to silence anyone who threatens his version of reality." The restraining order also had unexpected public consequences. Local media outlets picked up the story of the mystery sister who'd emerged to support her niece's efforts to address family trauma. Patricia found herself thrust into a spotlight she had spent decades avoiding, her carefully constructed privacy invaded by reporters seeking comment on the Finley family's ongoing saga. But rather than retreating back into anonymity, Patricia made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She agreed to be interviewed by the Seattle Times about her experiences with family abuse and recovery. The resulting article, titled "The Sister Who Got Away: A Finley Family Member Speaks Out About Generational Trauma," became one of the most read stories in the newspaper's history. Patricia's account of escaping an abusive home, rebuilding her life, and eventually finding the courage to support other family members seeking healing resonated with thousands of readers who'd experienced similar situations. More importantly, the article attracted the attention of other professionals and organizations working on issues related to family trauma and recovery. Within days of its publication, Kali and Patricia were contacted by researchers, therapists, legal advocates, and policymakers interested in understanding how families could break cycles of abuse and secrecy. As 2024 drew to a close, Kali realized that what had started as a personal crisis had evolved into something much larger. The Finley family story was becoming a case study in both the destructive power of family secrets and the transformative potential of truth-telling and accountability. But the deepening complexity of the situation also brought new challenges and unexpected responsibilities that would test Kali's commitment to healing in ways she had never anticipated. The crisis began with a phone call at 3:47 a.m. on a frigid January morning. Kali was pulled from deep sleep by the jarring sound of her cell phone, and she knew immediately that something terrible had happened. No one called at that hour with good news. "Is this Kali Finley?" The voice belonged to a woman she didn't recognize, professional but strained. "This is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison at Harborview Medical Center. Your mother, Rebecca Finley, asked me to call you. She's been admitted to our psychiatric unit following a suicide attempt." The words hit Kali like a physical blow. Her mother, the woman who'd spent her entire adult life maintaining perfect appearances, who'd never shown a crack in her composed exterior, had tried to kill herself. "Is she—" Kali couldn't finish the question. "She's stable," Dr. Morrison replied. "But it was a serious attempt. Overdose of prescription medications combined with alcohol. If your father hadn't found her when he did—" Kali was already pulling on clothes as the doctor continued. Rebecca had been discovered unconscious in her bedroom by Marcus, who'd returned late from a business dinner to find her unresponsive beside an empty bottle of Xanax and a half-finished bottle of wine. The note she'd left was addressed to Kali, which is why the medical team had insisted on calling her despite the ongoing family estrangement. The drive to Harborview took 25 minutes through empty Seattle streets, but it felt like hours. Kali's mind raced through every interaction she'd had with her mother over the past few months, searching for signs she might have missed. Rebecca's voice during their last phone conversation 3 weeks ago had sounded tired, maybe even defeated, but Kali had attributed that to the stress of the ongoing family drama. She arrived at the hospital to find Marcus in the psychiatric ward's waiting room.
looking like he'd aged a decade in the months since David's sentencing. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his face gray with exhaustion and what looked like genuine terror. "She left this for you," he said without preamble, holding out an envelope with Kali's name written in Rebecca's careful handwriting. Inside was a 3-page letter that revealed the depth of pain Rebecca had been carrying in silence. She wrote about the crushing weight of maintaining the family's public image while knowing that their private reality was built on lies and covered-up trauma. She described feeling trapped between her loyalty to Marcus and her love for Kali, unable to support either without betraying the other. But the most devastating revelation was Rebecca's confession about her own childhood. She hadn't just married into a family with a history of abuse, she'd been escaping from one. Her father had been physically violent, and her mother had dealt with that violence by teaching Rebecca that a woman's job was to keep family secrets and maintain appearances no matter what the cost to her own well-being. "I thought I was protecting you by staying silent about what I knew, but watching you find the courage to tell the truth about our family made me realize that I've spent my entire life being a coward. I've enabled abuse by calling it loyalty, and I've justified lies by calling them family business. I can't live with what I've become, and I can't figure out how to become anything else." The letter continued for 2 more pages, detailing Rebecca's growing desperation as the family crisis had escalated. She'd watched Marcus become increasingly controlling and vindictive, had seen him try to destroy Kali's reputation through whisper campaigns within their social circle, and felt powerless to stop the man she had once loved from becoming more like his father with each passing day. "Your father hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Patricia and that paramedic who helped you," Rebecca had written. "He's planning to use whatever he finds to discredit their testimony about our family. He's also talking about suing you for defamation and trying to have your professional license revoked. I can't watch him destroy you the way his family destroyed itself, but I don't know how to stop him." The final paragraph was the most heartbreaking. "I'm sorry that I failed you as a mother. I'm sorry that I chose comfort over courage, silence over truth. I hope that my death will at least free you from having to choose between your principles and your family, because it will mean you no longer have a family to disappoint." Kali was still processing the letter's contents when Dr. Morrison approached with an update on Rebecca's condition. The overdose had caused significant physiological stress, but the more immediate concern was her mental state. Rebecca was experiencing what the psychiatrist called acute adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, essentially a complete psychological breakdown brought on by chronic stress and unresolved trauma. She had been carrying an enormous emotional burden for a very long time. Dr. Morrison explained, "The recent family crisis appears to have been the final stressor that overwhelmed her coping mechanisms." Over the next several hours, as Rebecca slowly regained consciousness and began the initial stages of psychiatric treatment, the full scope of the family's destruction became clear. Marcus's response to his wife's suicide attempt wasn't grief or self-reflection. It was rage at Kali for causing this mess, and determination to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to manage.
"Look what you've done," he said to Kali in the hospital corridor, his voice filled with venom. "Your mother is fighting for her life because you couldn't leave well enough alone. Are you satisfied now? Is this the healing you wanted?" But Marcus's anger was masking something deeper and more frightening. Patricia arrived at the hospital that afternoon, and her presence seemed to trigger something in Marcus that bordered on complete psychological breakdown. He began ranting about how Patricia had abandoned the family when we needed her most, and how her return was part of a conspiracy to destroy everything I've built. It was Janet Rodriguez, arriving to offer support after hearing about Rebecca's hospitalization, who first recognized the signs of what she called narcissistic collapse, the psychological phenomenon that occurs when someone whose identity is built on control and superiority is forced to confront evidence of their own destructiveness. I've seen this before, Janet quietly told Kali and Patricia as they watched Marcus pace the waiting room, muttering to himself and occasionally lashing out at hospital staff. When people who've built their entire sense of self on being better than their abusive parents are confronted with evidence that they've become abusive themselves, they sometimes have complete breaks from reality. Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic over the following days. He accused the hospital staff of being part of a plot to undermine his family. He claimed that Dr. Chen had brainwashed Kali and Patricia against him. Most disturbingly, he began making threats against the medical team treating Rebecca, against the reporters who'd covered the family's story, and against anyone he perceived as being responsible for the family's public humiliation. The situation reached a breaking point when Marcus attempted to check Rebecca out of the hospital against medical advice, claiming that the psychiatric treatment was just another attempt to turn her against her own family. When hospital security intervened, Marcus became physically aggressive, resulting in his own detention and evaluation by the hospital's psychiatric team. Dr. Morrison's assessment was grim, but not entirely surprising. Marcus was experiencing what she called delusional disorder with persecutory features, a condition where someone maintains rigid, false beliefs about being persecuted or betrayed, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The stress of watching his carefully constructed family image collapse had apparently triggered underlying psychological vulnerabilities that probably had been developing for years. The pattern we're seeing, Dr. Morrison explained to Kali, Patricia, and Dr. Chen during a family conference, is actually quite common in adult children of severe abuse. Marcus spent his entire adult life trying to prove he wasn't like his father, but the core belief system that drove his father's behavior, the need to control others, the inability to tolerate challenges to his authority, the tendency to blame others for his own emotional responses, those patterns were never addressed. The revelation that Marcus was now requiring his own psychiatric treatment while Rebecca remained hospitalized represented the complete collapse of everything the Finley family had pretended to be. The successful businessman and his elegant wife, the perfect couple who'd overcome their difficult family history through hard work and determination, were now both psychiatric patients whose carefully maintained facades had finally cracked under the pressure of suppressed truth. But the crisis deepened further when David, still serving his prison sentence, received news of his brother and sister-in-law's hospitalizations. His response was to attempt his own suicide using a makeshift noose constructed from bedsheets in his cell. Prison guards found him in time, but the incident resulted in his transfer to the medical unit and placement on suicide watch. Within the span of 1 week, 3 members of the Finley family had either attempted suicide or experienced complete psychological breakdown. The pattern that had begun with Richard Finley's abuse of his children, had continued with Michael's death and David's violence, had now reached its logical conclusion in the total destruction of the family unit. Kali found herself in the surreal position of being the only functional member of her immediate family while simultaneously being blamed by that family for their dysfunction. She was fielding calls from reporters wanting updates on the Finley family tragedy, managing complex medical and legal decisions for family members who'd disowned her, and trying to process her own grief and guilt while maintaining her demanding job at the youth center. "This isn't sustainable," Dr. Chen warned in one of their sessions. "You're trying to save people who aren't ready to be saved, and you're destroying yourself in the process." The crisis phase of Kali's journey had arrived with devastating force. Everything she had hoped to accomplish, healing her family's trauma, breaking their cycle of abuse and silence, creating accountability and recovery, had instead resulted in the complete breakdown of everyone she had been trying to help. As she sat alone in her apartment that night, surrounded by hospital discharge papers, psychiatric evaluation reports, and legal documents related to her parents' ongoing care, Kali faced the possibility that her efforts to heal her family had actually made everything worse. The truth she had insisted on revealing had destroyed rather than liberated, and the accountability she had demanded had broken rather than strengthened the people she loved most. For the first time since this journey began, Kali wondered if her father had been right all along, if some secrets were meant to be kept,
and some family dysfunction was better managed through silence than exposed through painful honesty.
6 months after the crisis that had destroyed her family as she'd known it, Kali stood before an audience of 300 mental health professionals, legal advocates, and trauma survivors at the Pacific Northwest Conference on Family Recovery. The woman who'd once been afraid to speak up about her uncle's assault was now delivering the keynote address on breaking cycles of intergenerational abuse, a transformation that would have seemed impossible during those dark days when everyone she loved was hospitalized or detained. But the breakthrough that had led to this moment hadn't come from any single revelation or dramatic turning point. Instead, it had emerged gradually from the ashes of her family's complete breakdown, built through months of grueling work that had tested every principle she'd held about healing, accountability, and the power of truth. The turning point had begun with an unexpected source: Tommy Morrison, the construction worker David had assaulted at O'Malley's pub. 3 months after the family crisis, Tommy had contacted Kali through the victim advocacy program that had helped him navigate David's trial. "I've been following your family's story in the news," Tommy had said during their first meeting at a small coffee shop in Georgetown. "And I keep thinking about what you said in court, about how violence gets passed down through families until someone finds the courage to stop it." Tommy's own story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He'd grown up in a household where his father's alcoholism had led to regular beatings for Tommy and his younger sister. As an adult, Tommy had struggled with anger management issues that had cost him relationships and job opportunities. The night David had assaulted him, Tommy had actually been the one who'd initiated the confrontation, triggered by something in David's behavior that had reminded him of his own father's unpredictable rage. "When David hit me, it was like looking in a mirror. I saw myself at my worst moments, all that pain and anger looking for someone to blame. That's when I realized that maybe we were both victims of something bigger than either of us understood." Tommy's perspective had been transformative for Kali's understanding of her family's situation. Rather than viewing the crisis as evidence that her efforts had failed, she began to see it as the necessary collapse of a dysfunctional system that had been causing harm for decades. The hospitalizations and breakdowns weren't signs that truth-telling was destructive. They were evidence that the family's previous coping mechanisms had never actually been functional. This realization had led to Kali's most important breakthrough: the understanding that healing trauma often requires what Dr. Chen called therapeutic crisis, a period where old patterns completely break down before new, healthier patterns can emerge. Working with Dr. Chen, Kali had developed a comprehensive family recovery plan that addressed each member's specific needs while also changing the overall family dynamics. For David, this meant completing his prison sentence while participating in intensive trauma therapy and addiction treatment. For Rebecca, it required extended residential treatment that addressed both her suicide attempt and the childhood abuse she'd never processed. For Marcus, it meant confronting his own psychological issues while learning to rebuild relationships based on honesty rather than control. The process hadn't been linear or easy. Marcus had initially refused all treatment, continuing to blame Kali and Patricia for destroying the family, even while receiving psychiatric care for his delusional disorder. It had taken months of therapy before he'd been able to acknowledge his role in perpetuating the family's dysfunction. But the breakthrough moment for Marcus had come during a family therapy session that included Kali, Patricia, and Rebecca via video conference from her treatment facility. Patricia had finally shared the full story of her escape from the family home, including details about the night she'd left that Marcus had never known. "I waited until I heard you crying in your room," Patricia had told him, her voice gentle but firm. "You were 15, and you just had another fight with Dad about your college plans. I stood outside your door for an hour wanting to say goodbye, wanting to tell you I was leaving. But I was terrified that if you knew, you'd try to stop me or want to come with me, and I couldn't protect you the way I'd tried to protect Michael and David." For the first time since childhood, Marcus had broken down completely,
grieving not just his sister's disappearance, but his own role in the family's dysfunction. That moment of vulnerability had marked the beginning of his actual recovery process. Rebecca's breakthrough had been different, but equally profound. During her treatment, she'd discovered that her pattern of enabling abuse wasn't just about fear or loyalty, it was a trauma response she'd learned as a child in her own abusive home. Understanding the psychology behind her choices had allowed her to begin making different ones. I spent 40 years thinking I was protecting my family by keeping their secrets, but I was really just protecting myself from having to feel the fear and helplessness I'd experienced as a child, she had said during one of their therapy sessions. David's recovery had been the most complex, requiring him to process not just his childhood trauma, but also his guilt about Michael's death and his responsibility for the violence he'd committed as an adult. But his breakthrough had come through an unexpected source: art therapy using the photography skills he had abandoned years earlier. Working with a therapist who specialized in creative approaches to trauma recovery, David had begun documenting his healing process through photographs. His first series, titled Fragments, consisted of close-up images of broken objects, shattered glass, torn fabric, crumbled concrete, that gradually gave way to images of repair and reconstruction. Taking pictures again feels like getting a part of myself back that I thought was gone forever, David had written to Kali from his treatment facility. Michael always said that photography was about finding beauty in broken things. I'm finally starting to understand what he meant. But the most significant breakthrough had been the family's collective decision to transform their private healing into a resource for other families facing similar challenges. Working with Dr. Chen and several other mental health professionals, they developed what became known as the Finley Protocol, a comprehensive approach to addressing intergenerational trauma that combined individual therapy, family systems work, legal accountability, and community support. The protocol had attracted national attention from researchers studying family violence and recovery. Within a year of its development, it was being tested in pilot programs across 12 states, with preliminary results showing significantly better outcomes than traditional approaches that focused solely on individual treatment. Kali's role in this larger movement had evolved far beyond her original goal of helping her own family heal. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job at the youth center to pursue a master's degree in family therapy, with plans to specialize in intergenerational trauma recovery. She'd also become a sought-after speaker and consultant, helping other families and organizations understand how to break cycles of abuse and secrecy. Patricia had joined her in this work, using her decades of experience as a guidance counselor to develop educational materials for teenagers from troubled families. Together, they'd created workshops that taught young people how to recognize family dysfunction, seek appropriate help, and avoid perpetuating harmful patterns in their own future relationships. Even Tommy Morrison had become involved, sharing his story at conferences and support groups to help other men understand the connection between childhood trauma and adult violence. His friendship with David, developed through their shared participation in a restorative justice program, had become a powerful example of how accountability and empathy could coexist. As Kali concluded her keynote address that day, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than 2 years. The young woman who'd once been afraid to tell her parents the truth about her uncle's assault had become a nationally recognized advocate for family healing and trauma recovery. The cost of telling the truth about family abuse is often enormous. It may destroy relationships you thought were solid, challenge beliefs you thought were fundamental, and force you to rebuild your entire understanding of who you are and where you come from. But the cost of continuing to live with family secrets is even higher. It's the ongoing destruction of everyone you love, one generation at a time. The standing ovation that followed felt like validation, not just for her work, but for every difficult choice she'd made along the way.
In the audience, she could see Janet Rodriguez, who'd become a close friend and frequent collaborator. Dr. Chen was there too, beaming with pride at how far the entire family had come. Later that evening, at the conference reception, Kali received a text message that perfectly encapsulated how much her family's situation had changed. It was from David, who'd been released from prison the previous month and was now living in a transitional facility while continuing his treatment. "Saw your speech online," the message read. "Michael would be proud. How I'm proud. You did what none of us were brave enough to do. You told the truth even when it hurt. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we gave up on ourselves." As Kali looked around the reception, seeing hundreds of professionals and survivors committed to breaking cycles of family trauma, she realized that her personal crisis had become part of something much larger than she had ever imagined. The Finley family's story of abuse, secrecy, and eventual healing had touched thousands of other families struggling with similar issues. The woman who'd once believed that keeping family secrets was an act of loyalty had discovered that telling family truths was actually the deepest form of love. Love courageous enough to risk everything in service of genuine healing and transformation. 6 months later, when Marcus was discharged from his treatment program, and the entire family gathered for their first holiday meal together in 3 years, they weren't the same people who'd been destroyed by crisis. They were something entirely new, a family that had learned to base their relationships on truth rather than image, accountability rather than control, and love strong enough to survive the complete breakdown and reconstruction of everything they'd once believed about themselves. The Finley meme would never again represent perfect facades and hidden secrets. Instead, it had become synonymous with the possibility of breaking free from even the most destructive family patterns, and the hope that healing was possible for anyone brave enough to choose truth over comfort and love over fear.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.